Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we hear from a team that went to Iraq to ride along with national security forces trying to purge the country of ISIS sleeper cells.
Go, go!
So it's a little past 1 a.m. We're here embedded with the counterterrorism service. This is the most elite fighting force in Iraq, and tonight they're going to raid ISIS sleeper cells.
Well, thank you guys for joining me to talk about your excellent documentary. You guys spent about a month, I think, in Iraq reporting on ISIS. ISIS was defeated, right?
No. Yes and no. I think what we found, and what kind of has been the case, is that after Abu Bakr Baghdadi was killed, a lot of the politicians were happy to take the credit and say ISIS is defeated, fighting is over, the war is done. But the reality is when that happened, much like so many wars before it, the remnants of that military spread all over, and they went into a different kind of hiding and kind of mode than they were then before. It's not a state anymore. It's kind of an underground criminal network. And since that happened, since 2017 or 18, when the end of the Mosul fighting happened, they've kind of been building that empire in its own way. And as it builds, it's really changing the way that Iraq is functioning as a country. Iraq is responding to terrorism and shaping its counterterrorism methods. Mm-hmm. But in reality, no. ISIS is now stronger than it's been in a long time, really? And developing into something that in the next couple of years could be a bigger risk to the country than people expected.
And Tariq, you produced this piece. What were the challenges of trying to tell this story? You can't really find ISIS. I mean, I suppose you went on a raid. Talk me through the production process.
It's silly to say ISIS is defeated because it's not an army that is exactly with borders that you kind of defeat and things settle down. You're fighting an ideology, and you're fighting a very organized, low-simmering movement that's been building up since the late 90s, and it was sparked by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. At the end of the day, ISIS fighters and believers of ISIS are citizens. They're Iraqi, they're Syrian, they're Tunisian, they're Pakistani. They're sure Iraq and Syria was the ground, but at the end of the day, you're talking about the same people, the same men and women that were born and raised in these areas. So for someone to say the war against ISIS is over, I think that's just not. That's not a good statement if you really understand what an ideology means.
And how did you put together that raid that you guys went on? How did getting access to that go?
It was quite complicated.
It was a lot of work.
Iraq, the Iraqi security forces are not. It's not only one division. There are many divisions. There's the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Group, and there are a bunch of Shia militias that are, most of the time supported by Iran, but also supported by the Internal Defense Ministry in Iraq. There is the Iraqi army. There is the federal police that is connected to the Interior Ministry. There's so many different sectors, but I think the most prominent one in the fight right now is the counterterrorism unit, CTS. Mm-hmm. also belong to the defense ministry, but they're American trained, American equipped. Their budgets are humongous. They operate like a ministry on their own. So they have a lot of resources to fight Daesh. And we in the beginning we went on literally 6 different embeds in 1 month with all these different security forces, from PMF to Army to Federal Police. And then at the end, we went with the CTS, and that's what we decided to include in our piece, because that raid was very organized, was very much planned, and it was very productive.
Iraq has had a lot of experience fighting counterinsurgencies, right? Given that since the US-led invasion in 2003, there has been quite a bit. From your reporting, from what you saw, are they doing new things to try to tamp down ISIS that they didn't do to other militias and groups that were fighting in the past?
Yeah, they are. I think there has been kind of a change in the way Iraq fights its wars. I think after 2014, after the invasion of ISIS coming in from Syria and sweeping through all this land very easily, America, who had left in 2011, and coalition forces, they came back. And what happened was a big retraining, big kind of reorganization of how do we kind of make this fighting force self-sustaining. Now, is it self-sustaining perfectly? Of course not. I mean, what force is? What governmental body is perfect? But in a lot of ways, the support that came from the coalition over the past 4 or 5 years has been important in the way that they've developed their schemes of fighting ISIS, having counterinsurgency programs. But not all of them are great. I think, like Tarek said, we embedded with 6 different fighting forces, 6 different budgets, 6 different crops of soldiers, 6 different ideologies. It was really a different kind of game to each one, and kind of system to each kind of way that they worked. So in a way, a lot has changed. But in other ways, there's still a lot of the same old simmering problems that there were before the war.
Right. And I mean, when you talk about the 2003 US-led invasion, this is the precursor to what we're seeing now with ISIS, what you guys saw on the ground. Tarek, you grew up in Iraq. What was it like growing up there? How did the war affect your life and the work that you do?
I mean, many wars have affected my life. I think, born in the early 90s, so right after the Desert Storm and the economical imposed sanctions on Iraq. So I grew up, in when Iraq was at its worst. The infrastructure was collapsing after 8 years war with Iran, and then the sanctions obviously didn't help. And I think that's, that when, in my opinion, the Iraqi society started to break down. People were guided by, extremism and ideology slowly because of poverty, really. And it was a way for Saddam or other leaders to kind of gain control and trust with the society again, is by talking religion with them. No one can argue that, in societies like Iraq. After that, the 2003 invasion happened, and as much as that was, I think, a hopeful, action by many who were living under the Saddam regime, who were being oppressed, who have been living in poverty for a decade or more, that came with a hefty price. And that's not the first time the U.S. does something like that, going and invading a country without a planned mission, I guess. But I think to bring it back to my experience and our story, we ran through a very violent sectarian war from 2006 to 2007, and that empowered both sects. I think Al-Qaeda on one hand and the Shia militias on another hand. And then when the government was completely controlled by a Shia government supported by Iran, the army and the police forces in Sunni territories were operating in a sectarian behavior, which, added a lot of pressure on Sunni communities. And then essentially that became a very easy transition to welcoming ISIS to that part of the country and giving them all the support they need, and also pledging allegiance to that movement.
And then as, the story is about ISIS as it may be reforming, how the government is trying to fight against it, but the root causes of extremism, as you talked about, oftentimes come down to poverty, opportunity from an economic perspective, just basic dignity. At the moment, it doesn't seem like the Iraqi government is necessarily providing those things to people. There was the protest movement last couple of years, lots of corruption. When you guys were there, did you find that conversation happening between people?
Well, I think one of the biggest thing that we also focus on in our story with the widow of an ISIS fighter is the fact that there are tens of thousands of children that were born during the Islamic State years, Iraqi children, essentially, who are not being really looked at as Iraqi citizen, because there is a transfer of government, basically. So you have an entire generation, essentially, that doesn't have any representation or government paperwork, really. And the process to get those documents is quite complicated. So up until this year, when we interviewed the widow in our story, the Iraqi government just declared a new law that if you disavow your deceased husband, you may be eligible to receive documentation to your children.
تبرأت من الزلمة اللي عشت معاه يعني 20 سنة على مود ولادي، على مود أحمي ولادي وأحمي نفسي.
That's a complicated thing, right?
Yeah.
Because especially in the case of our subject, she's someone that doesn't necessarily think her husband is a terrorist. He's someone that was good to her and her children, and he did the things that he did for a reason. He was someone that was in prison for something we're not, very sure about, but she claims that he was innocent, and he was tortured in the prison for a while, and he got freed by ISIS when they broke the locks on prisons. And when he came out, his only option was to join ISIS and revenge against the government that tortured him for 2 years. So it's complicated. There's also a lot of bullying. They're always looked at as, your ISIS families, your ISIS children. Your dad was an ISIS fighter. Your dad is a terrorist. Your mom is a prostitute. Whatever. And I think this kind of environment is the perfect formula to recreate an extremist group. Because you're being oppressed, you're being looked out on, you're not giving your rights, you're not really being put in any kind of rehabilitation programs that kind of transition you to normal society. And this is really one of the biggest problems that I foresee in the near future is we have a huge number of people that is not going through any kind of transition process.
And a lot of them are young people, a lot of them are children, a lot of them are teenagers, young adults. And so what I was interested to talk to you guys about, and we were talking about this before, is just sort of like the cycle of anti-terrorism, fighting against terrorism, oftentimes then produces a generation of terrorists. Like, and you see it, or produces a generation of extremists, of people who are like, I don't like this because it was bad to me. So you saw it with the husband of that widow. I can't help in the raid scene, that when you were on the raid, seeing that guy, a hood is put over his head, and you see he has a family. And you see that those children witnessed their father being taken away. Now, I don't know what this guy, if he's a member of ISIS. ISIS is obviously a bad thing, like, easy to say that. But it just feels like that cycle, the conundrum of anti-terrorism is that it sustains itself by producing another generation. I think you see it really clearly in this film. This is such violence begetting violence, right? Or which is to say, like, the war, the toppling of a civil society, as flawed as it was, precipitated people cooperating with the U.S. and then people revenge for that. I guess like my big question is about the U.S. in a sense, because I feel like some personal culpability as a United States citizen to know that like we went in, like chose to invade the country you were born in, and then, you know, almost 2 decades later, piecing back civil society together is not going great.
So in the past, you know, the American influence on Iraq is ever present. It's something that you run into on any corner of any street in so many different ways. Right now, it's posters of Qasem Soleimani. Before that, in the past, it was, you know, pictures of different kinds of like martyrs that kind of represented anti-American sentiment. It's always kind of a thought process that kind of seeps in everything. The way that America is kind of approaching it is to say that they're going to kind of ease off and try to push away. We talked to some of the generals there, and a lot of them are making there's no real timeline for it, but let's call it a multi-year plan to kind of slowly start withdrawing troops. Under the Trump administration, it went down from about 5,000 troops, American troops in Iraq, to about 2,500, and that's how it's at right now. And those are mostly support staff, training, running kind of air operations and air support for Iraqi missions. But in the next few years, they want to ramp that down to 0. They want to grow a NATO presence and have like a troop presence that's more multinational. But the reality is, when we ask them, when we push them about, you know, do you feel culpable for the way that Iraq is? There's not really a clear answer. I mean, I think a lot of the way that America kind of reckons with what they have done in Iraq is to say, well, how can we kind of like push away? How can we like kind of slowly move out of this so that we kind of don't keep staying? And in a way, America did it once. In 2011, Obama proudly withdrew most of the forces from Iraq. In 2014, they went back under the umbrella of fighting ISIS. But now, they're still there. And I think in the next few years to see how that changes, especially now after Afghanistan, it was announced that the American troops are leaving there. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and how the American kind of approach to this country and the things that it's left with, the pieces that it's shattered into, are going to be reckoned with.
Tariq, Ben, thank you for your reporting, for the outstanding documentary, and for hanging out. It's fun to chat.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.